The hallways of Jefferson High were long, bright, and smelled of lemon wax. Every morning, I walked through those halls with my head held high. I wore expensive sneakers and carried a stylish backpack. I told my friends that my father was a busy businessman. I lied because I was afraid of the truth. The truth was much dirtier and smelled of trash. The truth was currently holding a mop near the school entrance. My father, Elias, was the school's head janitor. He wore a blue uniform that was always stained with grease. His boots were heavy and made a loud sound on the floor. His hands were rough, calloused, and often gray with dust. To me, he was a walking shadow of shame. One Tuesday, I was walking with Sarah, the girl I liked. We were laughing about a movie we saw over the weekend. Suddenly, I saw a yellow, wet floor sign ahead. Behind the sign was my father, scrubbing a spill. He looked up and his tired eyes brightened with joy. He raised a dirty hand to wave at me. "Hey, Tommy," he called out with a thick, gravelly voice. I felt a cold wave of heat rush to my face. Sarah looked at him, and then looked at me. "Do you know that man?" she asked curiously. I didn't stop walking, and I didn't look back. "No, he's just the janitor," I muttered under my breath. I could feel his gaze lingering on my back. I imagined the smile fading from his weathered face. My heart felt heavy, like a stone in my chest. But my pride was much stronger than my guilt. Every morning before the sun came up, our small house was completely silent and wrapped in cold darkness. My father always woke up very early to prepare my lunch for the long school day ahead. He stood quietly in the dim kitchen, standing under the weak yellow light of a single bulb. He spent his precious resting time packing warm rice and leftover meat into a blue plastic box. After carefully closing the tight lid, he walked softly into my bedroom so he would not wake me. He gently placed the heavy lunchbox into my backpack while I was still deeply asleep in my comfortable bed. I never saw him do this, but I knew his routine exactly because it never changed. He wanted to make sure I had good food to give me energy for my classes. But he never just closed the zipper and walked away to start his long, exhausting work shift. He always walked back to the kitchen table and tore a small piece of blank paper from an old notebook. His rough, dirty fingers, calloused from years of holding heavy mops, carefully held a cheap pen. He wrote a few quick words before tucking the little scrap inside the handle of the lunchbox. It was such a gentle, quiet action from a man whose hands only knew hard, painful labor. The grease stains under his fingernails contrasted sharply with the pure white color of the torn paper. He pressed the paper down gently, treating the simple message like it was a very valuable treasure. Then he finally left the house in the dark, heading to his difficult job at my high school. Hours later, the noisy school cafeteria was always filled with laughing students, loud conversations, and the smell of French fries. I usually sat at a crowded table in the center of the room with the most popular kids. I desperately tried to hide my cheap plastic lunchbox behind my tall, expensive textbooks. I slowly opened the lid under the table, hoping no one would pay any attention to my uncool homemade food. There, resting quietly on top of the food container, was always that same small piece of folded paper. The words written in his messy, heavy handwriting were always exactly the same every single day of the week. The short note simply read, "Have a good day. I love you," with a little dot at the end. I never took the time to truly read those heartfelt words or appreciate his daily effort. Instead of feeling grateful, a hot wave of pure panic and deep embarrassment would wash over me. I was terrified that my wealthy friends would see the messy note and ask questions about my family. I did not want them to know that my father was the sweaty man cleaning their dirty floors. I believed his emotional notes made me look weak, poor, and totally uncool in front of everyone. I quickly grabbed the small piece of paper and crumpled it tightly into a hard ball in my fist. I looked around the table nervously to make sure nobody was watching my hands under the table. Then I tossed the ball straight into the nearest trash can without a single second of hesitation. I thought those little papers were just another embarrassing sign of his pathetic, struggling life that I wanted to escape. I wanted a cool, successful father who gave me credit cards, not someone who wrote silly messages on torn notebook pages. I felt angry that he tried to reach into my private school life with his dirty hands. So, day after day, I aggressively threw away the purest things his tired heart ever gave me. I ate the delicious food in silence, never realizing the immense love I was throwing into the garbage. One cold evening in November, the heavy rain was hitting the windows of our small house. I was sitting on the living room sofa, feeling annoyed because my father was very late for dinner. The house was quiet, except for the loud ticking of the old clock on the wall. Suddenly, the sharp ringing of the telephone broke the silence and made my heart jump. I picked up the phone, expecting to hear his gravelly voice apologizing for the delay. Instead, a serious woman introduced herself as a nurse from the main city emergency hospital. She asked me if I was the son of Elias Thorne in a very soft tone. Then, she told me the devastating news that there had been a terrible accident at the school. My father was cleaning the high windows in the school gymnasium when he slipped and fell. He was working extra, exhausting hours late into the night when the building was completely empty. The nurse explained that he took this dangerous overtime shift just to pay for my extra math classes. I dropped the phone on the wooden floor, unable to process the heavy weight of her words. I ran through the dark, rainy streets until my lungs burned and my legs felt weak. When I finally reached the hospital, the bright white lights of the hallway blinded my eyes. A tall, tired doctor walked out of the emergency room with a tragic look on his face. He placed a hand on my shoulder and gently told me that my father had passed away. I did not cry loudly, and I did not scream in agony when I heard the news. Instead of immediate pain, a strange, freezing numbness took over my entire body and my mind. I simply stood there in the cold hallway, staring blankly at the clean white wall. It felt like I was trapped inside a terrible nightmare, waiting for someone to wake me up. Returning to our small, dark house later that night was the hardest thing I ever did. When I opened the front door, the air inside felt incredibly heavy, thick, and suffocating. The house was usually filled with the comforting sounds of his heavy boots and his loud coughing. Now it was swallowed by a terrifying, absolute silence that seemed to press against my ears. That sudden silence was much louder and more frightening than any noise I had ever heard. It echoed endlessly in the small living room and the completely empty, dark kitchen. I sat on the old, worn sofa for hours, desperately waiting for him to walk inside. But the lock never turned, the door never opened, and his familiar shadow never appeared. When the sun finally rose the next morning, the harsh reality of my loss slowly appeared. I woke up at my usual time and walked slowly into the cold, silent kitchen. There was no warm smell of cooking meat or fresh rice floating in the morning air. The kitchen counter was completely empty, perfectly clean, and heartbreakingly still. There was no familiar blue plastic lunchbox waiting for me on the wooden dining table. There was no small, torn scrap of paper carrying his messy handwriting and his quiet love. The deep, painful emptiness finally started to eat away at my chest like a hungry monster. A dark, heavy guilt began to grow inside my stomach, making it hard to even breathe. I realized with absolute horror that I would never see his tired, gentle smile ever again. I would never have the chance to say thank you for the meals or apologize for my cruelty. I had spent my entire teenage life being foolishly ashamed of the wrong things. Now I was left completely alone in this silent house with nothing but my bitter, endless regrets. A week later, I finally found the courage to clean his small, dusty bedroom. The room still smelled like his cheap soap and old work boots. While sweeping the floor, my broom hit something hard hidden deep under his bed. I reached into the dark space and pulled out an old, rusted iron box. I slowly opened the creaky lid, expecting to find old bills or saved money. Instead, the box was completely filled with thousands of tiny, crumpled pieces of paper. My hands started to shake as I carefully picked up a handful of them. I immediately recognized them as the exact same lunchbox notes I had thrown away at school. Tears filled my eyes as I looked at the familiar, messy handwriting saying he loved me. But when I accidentally turned one of the scraps over, my heart suddenly stopped. On the back of the paper, there was a beautiful, detailed pencil drawing. He had drawn a picture of me wearing a white coat, looking like a professional doctor. Frantically, I began to flip over every single piece of paper inside the box. Each one held a different sketch of my future that he had carefully imagined. In one drawing, I was standing proudly in front of the Eiffel Tower in Paris. In another, I was simply a grown man looking at the world with a bright, happy smile. My father used these simple scraps of paper to send me all his dreams and hopes. He poured his absolute belief into me, even though I always looked down on his difficult job. He had secretly gathered the notes I threw away and turned them into his greatest treasure. Sitting on his floor, I held his silent love in my hands and cried uncontrollably. Later that night, I felt completely exhausted and walked into the dark kitchen. When I opened the refrigerator door, the cold light shined on a small plastic container. Sitting alone on the middle shelf was the very last lunchbox my father had prepared for me. He had carefully packed it the night before he went to work for the final time. I took the plastic box to the table and sat in his empty wooden chair. The house was terribly quiet as I stared at the cold, silent meal in front of me. Slowly, I lifted the lid, feeling a heavy ache in my chest with every movement. Inside, the white rice and cooked meat looked perfect, just like every other day. I picked up a spoon and forced myself to eat the cold, dry food. Every single bite tasted bitter with my own deep regret and sadness. Warm tears began to fall heavily from my eyes, dropping right into the plastic box. I had never eaten a meal so full of pure, silent love before. As I wiped my eyes, I noticed something hidden under the edge of the lid. I pulled out a small, familiar scrap of torn paper with his messy handwriting. My hands shook violently as I read the beautiful words he had left behind for me. The little note simply said, "Don't be sad. You're my pride." At that moment, all the heavy shame I had carried for years completely disappeared. I held the small piece of paper tightly against my chest like a precious diamond. I looked up at an old photograph of my father in his dirty blue uniform. With a heart full of hope, I finally smiled through my endless tears.